It's great to be here this afternoon. I particularly enjoyed Dr. Ankett's presentation. He covered quite a lot of what I'm going to say today, but from quite a different angle, and possibly an angle I hadn't thought of. And obviously, as a British person, quite an interesting thing to follow. I'm quite glad that we had a presentation in between so that we could talk about that. But in all seriousness, he talked about school design and curriculum design that was set up for a certain purpose, both here and in other parts of the world, and also in the UK. And if you go and visit some of the exhibitors outside, you'll see that schools more or less look the same than they did 100 years ago. They haven't changed a huge amount. Some of the furniture looks a bit funkier now. We've obviously got tech inside the classrooms, but some of the stuff does look very much the same. And sadly, the example I always use is COVID. We all went home for periods of time and worked remotely and used innovation to do things, and then as soon as we could get back into school, that's exactly what we did, and then we carried on doing what we were doing before. So, which is probably all we can do at this particular moment in time. But I do hope, as the previous speaker suggested, I do hope that things are changing, things are forced to change. We know that our students are ahead of us in many areas, especially around tech and AI and various other things. And hopefully, what I'm going to talk about today, and what I'd hope is that great teachers or gurus, are up to that change and that challenge, and they work with their students and change. So I'm going to talk about global citizenship and cross-cultural competence. Okay, so you can see where the overlap is coming at it, but I'm probably coming at it from 180 degrees to a certain degree. So just a little bit more on my background. Thank you for that introduction. So British born, as I've said, but relatively unusually, I've spent most of my life outside the UK. I moved out of the UK aged 1 in 1971, so I haven't been teaching for 300 years, as was mentioned earlier. And I lived in 4 countries as a child, and I've lived and worked in 6 countries and territories as a teacher and as a school leader. And the reason I say territories, and this fits the earlier talk, is I have worked in one of Britain's remaining overseas territories on Ascension Island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And I have to say that some of the observations that were made earlier you would recognise and you would see in quite a traditional setup within a part of the world that is an overseas territory, but still part of the British dependent setup. So hopefully you can see that global citizenship is something that's inbuilt and something that's very important to me, certainly very important to my children. And I think the comment that was made earlier about students are defined by more than marks, that really resonates with me. I have 2 very different children. I do apologise if you've heard me speak before. I speak a lot about my children, very proud of my children, both in their 20s, both living in the UK, but both having lived overseas, both with very different academic backgrounds. But what has made them successful is the sorts of things they've picked up around being able to interact with other people from wherever they may be, and be able to work and have those great interpersonal skills, which for me is what builds on great global citizenship. I only have one weakness in my 54 years of living overseas, and that's my ability to pick up language. Okay, I speak a smattering of many languages, sadly apart from the 2 that we have here in Hyderabad. I have tried. My mother swears that my first language is Swahili because I grew up in Kenya. The rest of the world swears it's not because I don't speak any of it now. But yeah, that's the one thing I haven't done. But what I think I have done is, I have lived around the world and tried to be open-minded, tried to adapt, tried to learn about different cultures, different behaviours. And what I've found is that whether it's with the language or without the language, that as long as you're prepared to be seen to be trying, be seen to be adapting, then people are very forgiving. If you do the wrong thing, say the wrong thing, etc., then they're generally understanding as long as you have tried. I've been in India for I've been in the role for 2.5 years. I've been in India for 2 years. We had a slight visa issue, which I know is a common conversation in India about getting visas, and I had a little bit of a wait to get my visa to come in here. and I moved here from China, which was mentioned earlier, and that for me is really important because I get asked a lot about the comparisons between China and India, and I'll come back to some of those a little bit later. I came here at about the time that everybody said that India had overtaken China as the most populous country of the world. Okay, it wasn't just me, I don't think. Me moving didn't make that. So what do we mean by global citizen and cross-cultural awareness? Well, hopefully it's building on what the previous speaker said. You can go into Google, you could look at the world bodies, the IB, UNICEF, Oxfam, everybody's got a definition of it. For me, it comes back to what I said earlier, for me it's really quite simple. It's just making sure that there's a respect and understanding for people regardless of their background. And I use the word background deliberately, because for me that covers everything. It covers the socioeconomic side of things, it covers gender, it covers what people do and all the rest of it. And so for me, that's something that I always try to do. As I say, generally have good understandings in that. Okay, I don't know whether you noticed, but as you came in today, we've got some of the more efficient security teams in India. So there's a lady that's firmly not letting you go through the wrong door, but she's doing it in such a cheerful way and such a professional way that you can't be but thankful for that. It's not officious, it's not any way. And so I like to interact. You can't get angry with that. You just have to sort of revel in that. So why is it important that us, the schools here and the schools worldwide, build these competencies and build these global citizenship? Well, as we talked about earlier, I'm not going to get into the gold standard and reserve currencies. That's far beyond me. I'm not an economist. But, it's sort of rooted in the same sort of thing. We know that mobility is increasing. I hadn't thought about the birth rate issue, okay? But as I say, I've come from China. It's well known the birth rate is dropping in China. We run schools in China. We know that firsthand. My own country, the birth rate is dropping. As some of you will know, we have what is regarded as a very world-class health system around the world, and there's lots of conversations in the UK about mobility. My father sadly passed away last month, and when I was back visiting him in hospital before he died, you can't go into a British hospital without realising we can't cope without migration, without people mobility, And I had some amazing conversations with professional carers of my father, who did, to be frank, didn't believe me when I said, "Where are you from?" "I'm from Bangalore." "Oh, I'm in Bangalore next week." And they're looking at me with great sort of interest, And certainly one particular lady, a physio that was working with my father, just frankly didn't believe me. And still I started to describe it. So mobility is a key issue, I say, and Dr. Ankit has highlighted where some of that's come from. And of course, mobility, as I've just demonstrated, is hopefully working, and I don't want to get into the area he was talking about, but hopefully it's helping both countries involved in mobility. It's certainly helping the countries that people move to, and obviously we have many. I've given one example and many examples from other countries, but hopefully it's also doing something for the countries where people move from. I know that's something that's also a factor, possibly not in India, but I know it's in other smaller countries like the Philippines, where they do keep a tie on that and make sure that it's also protecting themselves. We know in our schools, and I'm sure many of the schools that are represented here, that our young people want to move overseas for education for all sorts of reasons. It could be partly to do with what I've been talking about, opportunities. It could be just partly to experience new things. As we touched about earlier, we know that you need more than grades to go overseas and to thrive in these places. We had a really interesting statistic, and I do apologise, it's a little bit dated. It's from 2013. But the South China Morning Post put a statistic out that 1 in 4 Chinese students who go to Ivy League universities drop out. And that's because they need these other skills. We all need these other skills. You cannot just take yourself from Shanghai or Beijing or Chengdu or wherever it is, plonk yourself into Harvard or wherever it might be, and expect that because you've got the good grades and all the rest of it, you're going to survive. So the one thing I found is, and I get asked this quite a lot, how do Indian parents compare to Chinese parents? And I always find that difficult to answer because there are 1.4 billion people in China and there are 1.4 billion people in India. So, you've got to be careful with generalizations. But if I was going to generalize, I would say that the parents that I speak to, the parents that are at our schools and parents I've met socially, friends of mine, they understand that. They understand that we need those wide skills, including that global citizenship and that global competency. And I think just going back to the point that was made earlier, I think that learning about other cultures and learning to cope in other cultures also helps you to be very clear and very sound in your own culture. I'm pretty sure that I could only spend the time that I've spent overseas, and my children could only spend the time they spend overseas, because I'm quite grounded in what I am, as in where I'm from. Now, those of you who know Britain, we're not quite as complicated as India with the states and the size and all the rest of it, but we have 4 distinct countries within Britain. So I'm divided between 2 of those countries. I'm half Scottish and half English. I sound English, so most people identify with me as English, but in fact I personally identify more as Scottish because that's where I've got a house. One of my children lives there, I went to school there, etc., etc. But I'm much more aware of that through the time I've spent coming backwards and forwards between that, I think. And I think that's really useful when people, people travel, young people travel, whether that's for, whether that's for education or whether that's for their jobs. And I think the good news is, and this is why I've got a positivity from what I was saying earlier, I think that young people today do have that natural curiosity. This is probably a good news story about social media. Social media gets a lot of negatives, but I think that social media in all its forms, that does throw up all sorts of interest, in terms of what happens around the world, and the things that we possibly do differently and the things that we do together. And I think another issue is, and this is obviously one of the reasons why people travel overseas, excuse me a second, is by travelling and by getting an understanding of what happens within other cultures, whether that's in different countries or different parts of countries, we have an understanding of various subjects. So, for example, environmental issues. How are we going to challenge the environmental issues that we have in India? How are we going to challenge the environmental issues we've got in Africa? How are we going to challenge the environmental issues we've got in Europe, etc.? And so coming together and sharing those ideas and sharing what has happened in our particular countries, I think is very good. And then, and famously, the Dutch and the Germans are very good at this. They think that the skills that one learns through studying or living in another country for a period of time really help you when you get into the workplace. So a lot of multinationals in European countries will insist on that. And I've talked to people here. The office block I'm in is full of multinational companies, and they're looking for people to obviously understand how things operate here, but also want to understand and have that cross-cultural, from a business perspective, understanding elsewhere. And hopefully that builds some of the softer skills that I touched on earlier in terms of tolerance, inclusion, and diversity. Okay, and those are all words that mean different things to different people, but if there can be, understanding in that, then I think that's good. So in summary of that section, I think it is, hopefully everybody would agree, a philosophical thing. It's the right thing to do. We should be tolerant of each other. We should be understanding of each other as best we can. But I think it's a practical thing as well. I think the practical nature with the move to globalization. I know there's been lots of talk about, the power of globalization in certain parts of the world, notably North America, where, they may be questioning their place in there, but there's no doubt that has to be the trajectory. And India and China are 2 great examples of that. So there are all sorts of practical reasons why they should be there. So lastly, my last 5 minutes, how do we do that in schools? I say hopefully nobody particularly disagrees with me. How do we do this in schools in India? We have a particular statistic in India. 93% of teachers in Indian international schools are from India. Okay, I don't see that as a particular problem. I don't think, and the reason I say that is because we've got teachers that have got that global background. So if I talk about the 5 principals that I work with, 4 of the 5 of them have worked at some point outside India and have got that experience of leading schools. Many of our teachers have done the same. But also the flip side of that, I think you can be really complacent that just because you've got a multicultural staff body, or you've got, maybe some British teachers in a school in Singapore, to take something from my past, I think you can assume. I think you can be a little bit too sort of you can sort of think that, well, okay, I've got this set up, therefore I must be promoting global citizenship, and I don't think you are. I think it's something you need to work at, and there's nothing worse than a school that their idea of global citizenship and cross-cultural competency is an event that you do one day a year or something like that, and looking at maybe doing the odd festival, maybe doing a bit of food or something like that. Whereas I think here, certainly in the schools that I work with, we work at it quite a lot to make sure that our students are heading out into the world, whether that's for university or work, with all of that. The formal curriculum helps. Okay, so obviously we've got the IB here as one of our knowledge partners, and obviously there are international curricula, and obviously their approach and also some of their curriculum content helps. And so, schools that are doing that can do that. But talking to my colleagues who are involved in the CBSE, obviously with the changes that have happened around there, we've got the same agenda in terms of trying to make sure that we build those skills, which I think is really important. Outside of the curriculum, we all know about things like MUN, we all know about the CAS and other community projects that we need to do as part of CBSE or as part of the IB, and they're all important. Even being involved in a project that is down the road within the same city, I think that starts to build the sort of skills that you need in terms of those cross-cultural competencies, mainly in terms of empathy and making sure that you understand the needs of other people and how you can try and promote that. And I think just policies that try to make sure that a school promotes the right sort of behaviour and promotes that interaction with each other. We have a particular advantage within North Anglia Education. Our 5 schools here partner with 80 odd schools around the world. We work most closely with 21 other schools in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. So we do take our students to conferences, we do go to expeditions together, our teachers do get exposed to conferences, and that all helps and puts part of it. But as I go back to what I said earlier, I do believe that's only part of it. I think the background and the structure is an element of it, but I think it's then what you do with it and making sure you're taking every opportunity. I finish on a point. This is a section that I spoke about in my graduation speeches in our schools this year. So I left school in 1988 and I left university in 1993, so 5 years between the two. And in that time, the Berlin Wall fell, we had the economic reforms here in India of 1991, Yugoslavia collapsed into 7 or 8 different countries, the Soviet Union disintegrated, various other things were happening. Sadly, we still had war in the Middle East, we still had tensions everywhere. And so my point is that change and dealing with all the things that we've dealt with in the last few years is nothing new. But I do strongly feel that our young generation of students, with their open-mindedness to how we all work together and this concept of global citizenship and looking after the world as a whole, I think, and I remain optimistic, that this is something that we can work on in years to come. Thank you very much.